Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Tony Rahm, the Congressional Economic Policy Reporter here at the Washington Post. We've got a great conversation scheduled for you today, taking a look at semiconductors or chips, those tiny little technologies that power pretty much everything that we use on a daily basis. We'll hear from two important figures today. First, we'll hear from Senator Mark Warner, a Democrat from Virginia, who was instrumental in seeing through the passage of the CHIPS Act. And then we'll hear from Governor Eric Holcomb, a Republican from Indiana, who's one of the many state leaders working right now to bring some of that semiconductor investment back to his home state. But first, we'll start with Senator Warner. So, Senator Warner, thanks so much for joining us today. How you doing?
I'm good, Tony. Thanks for doing this.
Great. So, I talked to you a bunch over the course of this debate, which has been, quite a long time in the making. But let's start with the basics here. For those who maybe aren't very well acquainted with this technology, what's the point of this semiconductor stuff? Why is it so important to them?
Well, semiconductor chips are in any device that we use that has an on and off switch. Think your cell phone, your automobile, your refrigerator, you name it. And this is an area that is going to have enormously increasing demand. For example, about 4% of the chips in the world today go into our automobiles. That's expected over the next 4 to 5 years to go to 12% of all the chips going into our automobiles, as we think not just about driverless cars, but the fact that our car is going to be constantly communicating with sensors that are placed all over the community. All of those items have semiconductor chips in it. This is an area that back in the 70s and 80s, we invented the whole technology and we dominated the field, making about 40% of the chips in the world. We've seen that number at 40% go down to about 12%, as frankly, this industry made a mass exodus because it was cheaper to build these facilities in Southeast Asia and places like South Korea and East Asia like Japan, but particularly in Taiwan. At the same time, we've seen the People's Republic of China, controlled by the Communist Party, dramatically increase their chip production. This is an area where it is about not only making sure we have some of that supply chain located not only in America, but also in allied nations, and also one more example of where we are in a 21st century competition with the People's Republic of China on technology domains. How we came to this was on the Intelligence Committee, where my friend John Cornyn and I are both seated, and I'm the chairman of the committee. We monitored this rise of China and decline of America, and candidly, the point where even no cutting edge chip, the most advanced for our airplanes, for our satellites, we didn't make any of them. They're all made in Taiwan, where we saw from the Intelligence Committee there was a national security imperative to bring back some of the supply chain. There was a jobs imperative. Frankly, without the CHIPS legislation, we would never build another fabrication facility. Chip manufacturing plants are called fabs. We would never have built another fab. This was a global competition, and we sounded the alarm from the intelligence national security standpoint, similar to the way we had sounded the alarm, Tony. As you know, we talked a lot about 5G and the rise of Huawei, again, a Chinese company dominating the domain. And we said we needed to step up. It took a long time. The sausage making was pretty ugly, but we now have this legislation as the law of the land, and it's set off an enormous competition between states all over the country to receive some of these investments, but it's also a competition with, candidly, countries all around the world as they all try to attract these semiconductor facilities to their respective countries.
So we'll parse out a lot of that stuff, including the national security implications. But let's start with the bill itself. This legislation includes about $52 billion to help some of these chip manufacturing companies and other sorts of tax incentives. Talk about the approach that you all took and why you took that approach in this bill.
Well, Tony, the bill is 52 billion, and roughly it is 40 billion, 39 to 40 billion in incentives to bring manufacturing and other parts of the supply chain back to this country. It's 12 billion in R&D related dollars. There's another 2 billion that sometimes gets excluded. There are a billion and a half that goes into next generation wireless called Open Radio Access Network. So we wanted to make sure we have the major manufacturing facilities. We want to also look at the supply chain. On top of that, there's another 22 to 24 billion in tax incentives. So that's $75 billion roughly package. Sounds like a lot, but China alone has put up $150 billion. We've seen in the year from when we passed the CHIPS bill in the Senate to when it finally got to the president's desk, we've seen the Europeans jump in the game in a major way. Matter of fact, the Germans have already secured a major Intel facility where they're putting forward 8 billion euro on that facility alone in Germany. So we wanted to have the legislation be both recognize we need the fabrication major manufacturing plants, which are literally sometimes, 10, 20, $30 billion investment, 5,000 jobs at a crack on average. But we also wanted to make sure we had part of the supply chain, the tools that go on those fabrication floors, the things like the packaging of the chips after the chip is created, how it's chopped up and actually delivered and packaged is another part of that supply chain. So we wanted to make sure we were competitive in all of these areas, but we also wanted to make sure that the design component of the chips, and we have major American companies like Broadcom and Qualcomm, for example, that are leading semiconductor firms, but they don't manufacture any chips at all. They design the chips and then outsource it to firms to actually make the production. We want to maintain that lead in the design component as well.
Sure. I mean, you sort of alluded to some of this when you were talking about what Germany and other countries in Europe and China are doing, but just given some of the activity we've seen in other parts of the world, I mean, is the US already falling behind again as these companies or these countries rather scale up the investments that they're offering these companies?
Well, clearly, we had been kind of asleep at the switch for a number of years. And, as long as, pre-COVID, when supply chains moved relatively smoothly, when there wasn't the awareness of the challenge that the PRC poses and its Communist Party leadership poses, it didn't prove to be a problem. COVID, we saw supply chains disrupted. One of the reasons why the price of automobiles went up so much in the last couple of years is because we have tens of thousands of cars that were made in America that were sitting in lots because they couldn't be delivered to the customers because there was a semiconductor chip shortage. So it had an effect on obviously on overall inflation numbers. So this idea that we'd fallen a bit behind is true, but I think we have not given up leadership in the design area. There are certain areas like the tools that go on these factory floors, very sophisticated. We and allies around the world still have a dominant position there. But if we hadn't taken this activity, which again is quasi-industrial policy, even areas where we still had a lead, we would be under huge threat. And one of the things I think that drove home the point, as we see the increasing tensions between China and Taiwan, recognizing that all of the most cutting edge chips in the world that were, or at least that we buy for our military, for example, all come from Taiwan. With Taiwan potentially under threat military or blockade threat from the PRC, that could be hugely disruptive. And again, a national security as well as economic risk.
Right. If there was one criticism, though, that I heard pretty consistently throughout the debate, and I think folks like Senator Sanders had been pretty vocal about this, it was this feeling that the U.S. really shouldn't have been in the business of giving so much money to what were already multi-billion-dollar multinational firms that potentially could have been making some of this stuff here in the U.S. in the first place. So I'd love to put that thought to you. I mean, why is the U.S. in the business of giving this money to these companies that already have quite a great deal of reserves already?
Because one, if we step back on a broader basis, for the last 50 years, we've said it is a national security imperative that we build our tanks, our airplanes, our submarines, that we have a secure domestic supply chain to make sure that we can equip our warfighter. And nobody pushed back on that. I mean, again, there's ways to become more efficient, obviously, and there needs to be reform in the whole DoD purchasing, but nobody said we shouldn't have that secure supply chain. There are a series of areas, and I think semiconductors is just one. I think we may have to make similar type investments in other technology domains where I think we've finally realized this is a national security concern as well. If we don't have access to these chips, it could pose an inability for us to have the high functioning jets, submarines, satellites that we need. It means that technology development in other areas beyond national security could be at risk if we don't have control over that supply chain, we and our allies. And what we've also seen is the whole rest of the world. We could have sat back and said, okay, we don't care about where these chips come from. We don't mind if they all come out of China or out of Taiwan, as perhaps Senator Sanders wanted to have happen. But I think that would have been a wrong national security move. I think it would have been a wrong economic security move. I think, again, as other nations around the world, European, India, countries like South Korea that's got, again, a chip incentive package bigger than America. Think about that, the size of South Korea versus the size of our country, yet South Korea is investing. This was where the global marketplace was. If we could roll back the tape and say, well, maybe we ought to had some of these investments paired with the ability for the taxpayer to get stock options or other incentives, that's a fair critique. Although the way the market had moved, and these firms do have other options, without this kind of legislation, none of these new manufacturing facilities would be built in America. They wouldn't have all necessarily been just China and Taiwan, but they would not have been built in America because this is where the market had moved.
Right. So let's dig into some of those national security concerns that you've talked about. I was struck by a comment from Commerce Secretary Raimondo when she said, quote, "Our dependence on Taiwan for the sophisticated chips is untenable and unsafe." We've seen the Biden administration take its own actions when it comes to chip security and export controls and so forth. Do you think the U.S. has done enough, and how concerned are you about some of these geopolitical tensions just further creating the chip shortages and other kinds of troubles that we've seen?
Well, Tony, as we think about what's called cutting edge chips, which again, we rely almost exclusively on Taiwan. That's really just making these chips tinier and tinier. The measuring stick is called nanometers, and getting below what's called 7 nanometers is where the cutting edge chips are. And again, we don't have that capability in this country. We will with some of the investments, for example, that Intel and other companies are making. We will when we continue to attract some of the leading Taiwanese firms like TSMC, which is the world leader, to build facilities here in America. But if we didn't have access to those chips, if Xi Jinping were to take military action against Taiwan or simply put in place a complete economic blockade, what it would do in terms of our national security ability, what it would do in terms of creating economic havoc, we would have a potentially not a recession, but a depression if we suddenly had those chips were cut off. So this is a type of investment that I think is absolutely critical to national security. We've got to continue to make both the design and the manufacture of these chips in America and in allied nations. And the failure to make this investment would have taken us out of the game.
Yeah, just to hone in on that point about a potential recession or some other economic calamity, you sit on the Intelligence Committee, you know this stuff so well. How concerned are you that in a world in which tensions between China and Taiwan boiled over, that they would seize TSMC, completely shut off some of those exports? Just, I would love to hear your thoughts on how much of a concern that is right now.
TSMC, a Taiwanese-based firm, is the crown jewel of Taiwan's economy. And China clearly has an interest in trying to have their own say over their own fate of their economy, and they would love to get their hands on TSMC. So the ability, and you hear President Xi in China constantly talk about the need to reunify. The goal would be not only reunification, I believe, for the Communist Party in terms of its historic precedents, but also the economic boost that would occur to the PRC if they were to suddenly be able to take over all of Taiwan's semiconductor assets, TSMC and a host of other companies. One of the things that we're trying to do is not only get TSMC to come to the United States, but what I would call so-called white label firms in Taiwan that make the chips, kind of the outsourced source of making the chips, fabricating these materials, these chips for other companies that are chipless fabs like the Qualcomms and Broadcoms, brand names here in America, but that actually outsource the actual manufacture of these critical semiconductor chips.
Right. To turn our attention back domestically, as we begin to run short on time here, we've seen a number of announcements from major companies like Micron, for example, which is now setting up shop in New York. And with it, we've seen some pretty gigantic incentive packages being offered by some of these cities and states to attract that business. How do you feel about what you've seen? And do you think that some of these cities and states have gotten the balance right between offering the right amount of money to attract business while not, essentially sacrificing their own economic futures and breaking the bank to do so?
Tony, that's a great and fair question, but it has been, as a former governor of Virginia and somebody who's trying to push Virginia to be more aggressive to go after some of these facilities, we are literally talking about great quality jobs that will exist for the next 10 to 20 to 30 years. Will states overbid? In some cases, yes. I'm sure they will. But having this kind of anchor of a major manufacturing facility, we do have, for example, one of the Micron chip makers in Northern Virginia. What it's done is helped provide not only the Micron facility, but a series of other companies that are part of the chip supply chain. So, I think many of these states, as they make the assessment about going after one of the large manufacturing facilities, are thinking not only will we get the manufacturing facility, but there will be a series of spin-offs and supply chains that go into that facility that will have long-term economic benefit. And chances are, Tony, because it will take 3 to 5 years to even build these out, in some cases even longer, making the judgment of whether we overpaid, both from the federal government incentives or state incentives, will probably take a number of years to prove out one way or the other.
Yeah, and on that point of the time horizon, I mean, we've talked about a lot of things, whether it's boosting the supply chain, hiring folks in some of these facilities and so forth. What does the time horizon look like overall for the country to kind of get on a better posture when it comes to semiconductors? It seems like it could be years off, even though some of the threats that we've discussed in the national security context are right in front of us.
Well, it will be years off before these manufacturing facilities go fully online. It'll be years off before the companies decide whether they actually make money off of these new facilities. But as I said, if we hadn't done this legislation, if this was not the law of the land, the one thing I could say unequivocally, none of these facilities would be built in America because it is cheaper to build in Asia. There are other countries, for example, where we are price competitive, like with Europeans. They are making, every country in Europe, even with countries with further left politics than ours, are making these kind of investments to try to attract these facilities and everything along the supply chain. This is a global competition. And I guess, Tony, my feeling is we need to get this right, and we need to be able to answer the concerns of Senator Sanders and others on the right who've been critical. But getting it right from a taxpayer standpoint, from a national security standpoint, and a job standpoint, implementing chips is going to be as important as getting it passed. But I do believe there will be other technology areas, particularly with our competition with China. We're going to have to make other type of national investments to stay competitive. I know my committee right now, the Intelligence Committee, which by default has kind of become the Technology Committee, we're looking at the whole realm of synthetic biology, the ability to grow new drugs or grow new chemicals, or frankly, dramatically modify how we make medicines. That is a huge opportunity area. China is investing at a level greater than ours. We may need to make sure we maintain our lead there. That is a national security issue. Advanced energy. From fusion, frankly, to electric batteries. We've seen the exit of our solar industry. I'm not sure we can fully appreciate the idea of the value of a Tesla here in this country if we don't also realize, well, if that battery is made in China, that electric vehicle battery is made in China with coal-driven energy creating that battery, then that carbon footprint of that Tesla becomes not as great as advertised. So we've got to look at those advanced energy supply chains as well. And we may need investments in those areas as well, both from a national security standpoint and from a technology competition standpoint. Because what we've seen, and I will circle back, I know we're running out of time, to Huawei and 5G, when we let China dominate a domain, as they did with 5G and Huawei. And it took a while to prove the point that that was a national security risk. If your phone call from St. Louis to LA is routed through China and that potential data could be scraped off, that's a concern that goes beyond just the cost of the equipment of who ought to be installing 5G technology. I think this is the competition of the 21st century. A lot of focus right now on Russia, appropriately, but the long-term competition with China on technology is where I think we're going to have to keep our eye first and foremost.
Great. Well, it sounds like you guys have a lot of work ahead of you. So, come back and talk to us again sometime. Thanks again for being here, Senator. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Tony.
Great. Well, we still have more to come in our conversation. We'll be sitting down with Governor Holcomb of Indiana in just a bit. But first, we have a quick little video for you. So don't go anywhere. Stay tuned.
You don't see us as factories keep rolling, transport keeps moving, power keeps flowing. But we're here, behind the scenes, because American industry and infrastructure will never run on technology alone. It will always require a human touch.
I'm Barbara Humpton, CEO of Siemens USA, and joining me today is Stephen Lopper, Principal and Smart Factory Leader at Deloitte. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Barbara. It's great to be here.
Right now, we're seeing major investment in advanced manufacturing by the federal government. The bipartisan infrastructure law has a focus on domestic battery production. The CHIPS Act will help us grow U.S. semiconductor production. And at Siemens, we see this investment as a key factor in the rise of what we've been calling globalization, the idea that we need to be able to tap into global innovation, but produce more things locally. Globalization calls on U.S. industry to produce high-end goods like chips and batteries that in turn require advanced manufacturing environments, deploying state-of-the-art technologies. So let's start from the perspective of a new facility. We're building a plant from scratch. What are the core essential technologies that make this advanced manufacturing environment a reality?
Well, Barbara, when building a new facility, or greenfield project as it's often called, there are many different aspects that one needs to consider, from the building itself to the operators inside to the processes and the technology stack that's going to run those factory operations. At Deloitte, we're seeing clients in the medical technology field, the energy sector via battery and renewable energy sources, as well as the semiconductor industry is leading the way on this trend, potentially influenced in part by government policy and investment in U.S. manufacturing. When it comes to the specific smart manufacturing technologies that should be implemented, we find that the most important aspect really comes down to data. How you equip your operations with the ability to collect and analyze data in real time, you can make smarter, better business decisions across your entire manufacturing network. One such example where we've combined artificial intelligence, machine learning, cloud and edge applications, as well as computer vision solutions, is really that around manufacturing vision analytics. This gives manufacturers the ability to use high fidelity video streams that run through a artificial intelligence processor to be able to point out areas where productivity can be enhanced in the manufacturing environment. To meet today's demands, organizations must take advantage of current and emerging technologies to holistically improve their operations. While automation and data collection technologies have existed for years, true smart manufacturing digital transformation is a complex transition that really requires specialized skills and solutions from a variety of companies and organizations.
Well, as we look to deploy these new technologies across U.S. manufacturing, one of the resources that we can tap into is a demonstration space that helps industry and government leaders explore the art of the possible. These spaces are typically stood up by government through the Manufacturing USA network, but also by the private sector. In fact, one of those spaces is the Smart Factory in Wichita, which is led by Deloitte, but we at Siemens have been supporting as a founding technology partner. What kinds of technology is the Smart Factory helping to seed into U.S. industry?
Yeah. No single organization or entity has all the answers or the solutions to improve manufacturing operations at the scale and speed we need to grow the economy and to meet demands. This is why Deloitte assembled one of the strongest smart manufacturing ecosystems in the world, made up of more than 20 world-leading tech innovators, including Siemens, to help address today's toughest manufacturing challenges. Manufacturers who visit the Smart Factory at Wichita will experience advanced manufacturing concepts that bring together edge computing, cloud, artificial intelligence, computer vision, and more as part of an interconnected system that leverages data to drive enhanced manufacturing operations. Our visitors take part in real-world demonstrations and participate in hands-on workshops to see these practical applications brought to life. Importantly, the Smart Factory is an example of how sustainability can be seamlessly infused into smart factory operations. It's a net zero building powered by a renewable energy grid, and it's outfitted with wind trees, solar assets, and smart lighting. You know, it's interesting. One of the questions I most often get when I describe this as a true working facility is, of course, well, what do you manufacture there? And we're producing STEM education kits that we distribute along with our ecosystem to schools and underserved communities across the United States, doing our part to inspire the next generation of STEM talent.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And actually, you lead me to this last thing I want to close on, which is the theme of how manufacturers can introduce new technologies and start up and scale them. Let's take the view now of an existing manufacturing plant that has legacy equipment and processes. A factory leader comes to you and says, how do I get started and how do I move fast? What guidance do you share?
Well, the reality is that there's no one single answer, and often it depends where a company is on their manufacturing journey and the associated priorities. Resilience has really rose to the top of the priority list, and after the disruptions that we've seen over the last few years with natural disasters, global conflicts, and of course the pandemic, being prepared is critical, and smart manufacturing operations are giving organizations the agility to help enable this. For a manufacturer with facilities that perhaps have outdated technologies and processes, many times the first step is reestablishing your ecosystem. Oftentimes, companies have a certain technology stack that's powering that environment, and by taking a look at some of the new technologies and really seeing how they fit into your manufacturing environment as part of a robust, refined ecosystem. Lastly, I think it's important that organizations are designing for impact and scale. And this is often one of the biggest challenges organizations have. And it's really, really critical that organizations are considering the effects and the impacts of the technologies that they're deploying across the full scale of their manufacturing operations. This truly underscores the power of the experiences that we offer here at the Smart Factory at Wichita, where manufacturing leaders really have the opportunity to explore these dimensions and more of smart manufacturing operations.
Well, I'm thrilled that we have experts like you to help guide us through this. But hey, everybody, let's get going. Now, let's turn it back to the Washington Post.
Hey, everybody, welcome back. I'm Tony Rahm, the Congressional Economic Policy Reporter here at the Post. For those who are just joining us, we're having a great conversation here today about the future of semiconductors and the recent legislation passed on Capitol Hill to boost their manufacturing here in the United States. Our next guest is one of the government leaders who's actually working right now to bring some of that investment back home. We'd like to bring up Governor Eric Holcomb of Indiana. Governor, how you doing?
We're doing great. Thanks, Tony, for having us.
Yeah, I really appreciate you being here. So, we just had a great conversation with the senator talking about the recent legislation on Capitol Hill and that $52 billion in new incentives targeting semiconductors. So let me sort of pose the question to you. What does that money mean for the work that you're all trying to do in Indiana?
Well, it means we all collectively, America, can get in the game. We were laggards and being left behind. And anytime that you don't have more control over your own supply chains, it puts you in a vulnerable position or even a weak position. And so, for a state like Indiana that's known for our manufacturing prowess, we're number one per capita in terms of manufacturing in America. This is what we do, and to have the world-class research and development universities like Purdue and Notre Dame and Indiana University and our community college, all these pieces snap together to form those kind of talent pipelines that will be necessary on day one, which was yesterday, on day one to make sure that we can catch up and go from, we used to be 75% and now we're 12. We got a long way to go and a lot of work to accomplish between now and when we are in a good position.
Right. And we'll talk about some of the issues that you just raised. But first, with respect to the supply chain, I would love to get your analysis of where we stand. I mean, we heard so much talk over the better part of the past year about the chip shortage. And while there are some folks who question whether it's as bad as it was, I mean, what sort of impact of that shortage, especially a few months ago, did you see in Indiana, in the local economy, and some of the economic activity within the state?
Yeah, I mean, we saw up close and personal. Again, we make 80% of the RVs in North America. We have five auto OEMs. The IoT, the Internet of Things, connects all of our home appliances. We're not just talking about computers and iPhones or mobile phones. We're talking about all the above. And as things get smarter and more efficient, et cetera, supercomputers, AI, our defense of our nation. So it's, our national security as well, which is what really kind of piqued our interest to begin with, just out of a patriotic duty. But absolutely, the disruptions and not having, be it batteries or semiconductors or you name it, raw materials, the more we can control our own destiny, obviously brings certainty and stability, predictability, continuity, all the things that are important for companies to make major investments, not just in their future, but in our workforce today.
Now, Governor, some of the things that you described sound like they would be nonpartisan or bipartisan, but some of your Republican colleagues didn't support this legislation when it came up on Capitol Hill. And on that note, I want to raise a question with you that we actually got from one of our readers. We'll put it up on the screen in just a second.
Sure.
Barry Bradford from Indiana said, Governor, I'm so proud of your leadership on the support bill. I cannot understand why our fellow Republicans refuse to vote by and large for this important legislation. Only two members of your congressional delegation voted yes. Can you explain this to those of us Republicans who believe America must be the leading economic and technological nation in the world?
Well, everyone has their, with all due respect, their own reasons. And sometimes we let the perfect become the enemy of good or progress. And certainly, this will require, absolutely underscore, double underline, require congressional oversight to make sure these funds are appropriated to the right places. And so America is truly the beneficiary of this investment. And what I would simply say is, what's the alternative? We have slipped, we have fallen behind. We have a lot of ground to make up. This has to do equally with our national security and with our economic security. They go hand in glove together. And so, we had plenty of time to debate what's a better way, but this gets us there. And this is nonpartisan. I really do believe this bill co-authored and ushered by Senator Young from the state of Indiana, who did just a yeoman's job of making sure this was shepherded through, working with the administration, working with Secretary Raimondo. We just were recent hosts to Secretary Raimondo and Secretary Blinken because they understood commerce and security of our nation state by state, and how the states would play a role in making sure we were training from GED to PhD. So a huge amount of opportunity, but for the ultimate right and urgent call, that being our security.
Right. So let's talk about some of the work that you're doing within your state. You guys recently announced a $1.8 billion facility, if memory serves me, Skywater, I believe. Talk a little bit about the investment that you guys have attracted so far and where you hope to go from here.
Yeah, we've had a lot of recent activity. I mentioned the secretaries, and you bring up Skywater, who has done defense work and production work in chips, and we're so semiconductors. We're so grateful that they recognized all the pieces were here. But a lot of work has gone into this in years and months and years ahead of those big announcements. And so we're seeking to create and cultivate the whole ecosystem, that being research and development, design, production, testing, packaging, shipping, the logistics side of all this. And then, by the way, when you talk about various parts of the supply chain, batteries, et cetera, recycling. And so we really have taken a holistic approach to making sure that our high schools, the partnerships, Indiana University having a partnership with high schools and with Crane, which is really the kind of center of the universe for training for the DoD. Crane is, the third biggest Navy base. Hard to believe, landlocked, but the third biggest American Navy base on planet Earth, and it sits inside of Indiana's borders. And so to have all these assets, certainly there are those on the coast, but to have it in the middle of America, in the Midwest, critically important, that all the pieces are coming, and we're developing the whole ecosystem, you know, not just the lab to fab. That's very important, but everything that goes into it. And again, that means opportunity and upward mobility. These are high wage, high demand jobs that are now going to be available in the heartland of America.
Yeah, and what is that facility, that Skywater facility, going to look like in 5 or 10 years? What are we talking about when we're describing these facilities? Like, what is the work? What's the economic impact you anticipate?
Uh, Hard to measure in terms of value. I would call it priceless, because they start out with hundreds of jobs, 750 jobs, $1.8 billion capex, capital investment, next to Purdue University. There, right on their grounds, actually, and then having a partnership with Crane, the Naval Warfare Center, but also that ecosystem, along with MediaTek, who is one of the biggest designers, chip designers, semiconductor designers in the world. And they're on West Lafayette, Purdue's campus, as well, designing the chips. And so again, this clustering that you're seeing with TSMC doing some research with Purdue, having Notre Dame involved, having Indiana University, having our community college. Again, this is a holistic effort in terms of opportunities, thousands of careers that are being put forward that are going to address something that can be crippling if that supply chain becomes supply pain. We want it to be supply gain, and we think they can realize that right here in the state of Indiana.
Right. You sort of alluded to my next question when you were talking a bit about the work that you're doing at local colleges and universities to get the workforce ready. But could you assess where the workforce stands right now? There are going to be many of these jobs open, not just in your state, but in other states. Do the
Yep.
workers exist to fill those roles in the short term?
Well, there will be some churn. We're at a peak private sector employment level right now. We're at 2.8% unemployment. We used to say 4%. It is full employment. We're at 2.8. We have almost a record low people claiming unemployment insurance benefits. And so we start with a very tight labor market. Fortunately, the state of Indiana, our population is growing, much due to the fact that there is career opportunity here. So they do in part exist because of the churn and the natural workforce churn that occurs when any new job announcement is made. But also, we're not resting on those laurels. We're going deep into the bench, into the farm team, if you will, into high schools, and actually building programs and pathways and pipelines that can be replicated. I think that's what I don't want to speak for the secretary, but we're both very passionate about workforce development. And Secretary Raimondo, I think that's what she really latched on to while touring Purdue was just the extent of these workforce development programs. So yes, we're getting people connected, working on while in high school, and then getting the proper certificate or credential or badge, depending on what part of the life cycle of semiconductors they're involved in, and then making sure that we've got master's programs. Purdue's developed a curriculum for master's and PhD level courses that are in motion right now. So no one's waiting on Indiana. We're waiting on the business to come here so we can contribute to our comeback.
Right. Now, everything you described is a reason that you would think a company or an employee would try to set up shop in your state. But I have to ask about the flip side of things. I cover the technology industry for more than a decade, and what I watched was that workers and businesses make decisions about where to set up shop for reasons that sometimes don't involve business at all. Social issues and political issues, those things factor in at the end of the day. And in Indiana, we know recently there was an abortion ban enacted that is still the subject of legal wrangling. Are you concerned that those sorts of policies could make it harder for you to recruit the kinds of workers and the kind of industry that you want to set up shop?
I'm concerned about a lot of things, and any piece of legislation I'm obviously aware of, but I also track. And different companies have different priorities. I respect that. What I can tell you is let's just look at the facts. Last year, capital investment that came in through our Indiana Economic Development Corporation was at an all-time high. This was last year, 8.7 billion. To date, through the first 3 quarters of this year, we're over 21 billion. We have obliterated our all-time high record of new business capital investment. There was just a report, an index of all 50 states that measured momentum, and they based it off of employment, capital investment, and population growth. Indiana was the only state in the Midwest to be above the national average. Only 3 states in America were outside the South and the West: New Jersey, Indiana, and South Dakota. Indiana, the only one in the Midwest. So I just look at the facts to develop the narrative, and the narrative is Indiana is growing, and we are growing exponentially in the high tech sector.
I certainly take that point, Governor, but I also remember a few years ago, I believe it was in 2015, that we saw Salesforce in particular start to pull some of its employees out of the state because of the religious freedom legislation. So just to kind of focus on there for a second, just given what we've seen with recent history, are you worried about that kind of thing happening in a world in which you're trying to attract some of these high-tech investments these days?
I wouldn't use the word worried. I'm aware and I track and I respect. And by the way, Salesforce's presence here in Indiana, which I appreciate, uh, is is one that is still hiring, and it's the second largest population, as I understand it, outside of San Francisco. So we are delivering. Our workforce is delivering for Salesforce, and a whole long list of. We just had another one announced today. Hundreds of new jobs in the tech sector this morning at very high wage levels, and so that's what I'm concerned about is making sure that we continue to grow and not the opposite.
Now, you recently took your pitch abroad, actually. You went over to Taiwan. Talk about your trip. What did you guys discuss there with respect to semiconductors?
Yeah, when I said Crane was the center of the universe for training for the DoD, Taiwan, we went a couple places in the last not 2 months, but we've been to South Korea, Seoul, and we've been to Taipei, Taiwan, and then most recently, about a week ago, little over a week ago, we were in Germany and Switzerland for different reasons. We travel with purpose, very methodical, very targeted. But obviously, Taiwan being the center of gravity or the center of universe in terms of semiconductor production and research, development, design, we wanted to make sure that we were true partners. We've had long-standing relationships with all four of those countries in terms of orthopedics, in terms of medical devices for with Switzerland, advanced manufacturing with Germany, and then obviously semiconductors, high tech, the high tech sector and IT sector with South Korea and with Taiwan. We wanted to make sure, look, the world is small and interconnected more so than it's ever been, and we want to make sure that that our friends around the world know that we're there, A, to help, B, that we are grateful, and we express our gratitude for all the past work that we've done together, but also in this time of great transition, um, that we want to make sure that we're discovering the future with them. And so we were sharing the Indiana story with some potential new partners that could be part of the ecosystem in the Midwest, in the state of Indiana. There's a lot of collaboration, and there's enough to go around to meet the demand, and that's what it's all about. Like we alluded to earlier, Tony, when we were talking about supply, there's also the demand, and we have to make sure that we know where we are in the cycle globally, and it's going to take partnerships that stretch and that are knitted all around the world to make sure that we're meeting that demand.
Right. And as we begin to run up towards the end of time here, I want to ask you just one other thing. You know, in trying to bring some of those businesses back, your state and others have been offering these really attractive incentive packages, tax cuts, other sorts of payments to just sort of get these companies to set up shop. But how do you calibrate those packages in a way that ensures that they deliver the economic
Yeah,
benefits they're supposed to without breaking the bank for a state?
yeah. Well, that's always the bottom line, and it has to pass that smell test, so to speak. And the way that we look at things in the state of Indiana, when we're putting a deal together, when the Indiana Economic Development Corporation is actually putting figures on paper, looking at volume, looking at cost, looking at incentives, we look at those incentives as investments. We look at what the ROI is, and it's based off of performance. So if the company, so we're not giving away the farm, we're not giving it away for free, we're getting a return of investment, and the companies are looking at this in terms of a forever deal. They're not flighty. They're making a major investment in their company's future, which is built on a workforce. And so they're making huge investments, and we want to make sure they know we're a full partner in this and that we're here to stay every step of the way for decades to come as we continue to explore and discover and determine what our mutual destinies are.
Right. And how do you enforce that at the end of the day? I mean, we've seen examples where this hasn't worked out for some states where they have
Yeah.
given these good incentive
Yep.
packages and the jobs just
Yep.
never show up. So how do you ensure that that happens?
Yep. Maybe we've learned from others' missteps, but when the job's created, then the carrot can be had, but and eaten. But it's not before. It's after it's been demonstrated. The performance has been demonstrated. That's how you scale up, and that's how you scale up together. Because look, we get it. Global affairs can intervene, and there's they call it a cycle for a reason, and they're affected by, it could be a Russian invasion, or it could be, you fill in the blank. Things happen, and so companies have to make decisions over a course of a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year deal that has to do with the future of their company for decades to come. So we get that. It's just it's not given before. It's based on performance.
Well, we'll have to see how everything performs, I guess, in the years ahead. Governor Holcomb, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
I'd love to invite you out, Tony, to put boots on the ground and see it realized in person.
Be careful what you wish for, Governor. Thanks again.
Perfect.
And thanks again, everybody, for joining us. I'm Tony Rahm, the Congressional Economic Policy Reporter here at the Post. And please be sure to find this panel and other conversations at our website, WashingtonPostLive.com. Thanks again, everybody.